She had cooked that meal without knowing it would be the last one. The gravy was still turning slow circles in the pot when Patricia Calloway set down her wooden spoon and looked out the kitchen window at the dry November yard. 7 hours she had been at it, pot roast in the oven since before sunrise, mashed potatoes whipped until they held their shape green, bean casserole assembled, the way Gerald liked it with the fried onions pressed flat on top. The apple pie had gone in the night before because she knew better than to rush a crust. Her wrists ached from the work. Her feet ached from the standing. Neither of those things was new. What was new was the silence coming from the dining room. Not the ordinary Sunday silence of people waiting to eat. This was a different kind of quiet altogether, the kind that settles into a room when something has already been decided and the only thing left is to say it out loud. Patricia carried the roast in on the good platter and set it at the center of the table without being asked. She had been doing that for years, setting things down without being asked, picking things up without being thanked, filling the spaces that no one else bothered to fill. The dining room of the Calloway house on Maple Street in Clover Creek, Tennessee, smelled like her labor and looked like Gerald's authority, which was more or less how everything in that house had always been arranged. Gerald sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood. He was 58 years old and built like a man who had once carried real weight and now carried only the memory of it. 2 fingers on his left hand were missing from the second knuckle, down lost to a conveyor belt in the coal mine outside of Oliver Springs 16 years ago. The settlement money had been enough to stop working, but not enough to stop hurting, and in the years since he had confused those 2 things with each other in ways that cost everyone around him considerably more than they cost him. Brett sat to Gerald's right. He was 35 and had his father's jaw and none of his father's patience for actual work. He talked about investment opportunities in the way that men talk about things they intend to let someone else execute. His boots were Ariat purchased at an outlet store in Cookville, and he wore them with the conviction of a man who had earned them on rougher ground than he had ever actually stood on. Donna, his wife, sat beside him with the composed expression of someone who had already rehearsed this moment and was simply waiting for her cue. Kevin sat across from Brett. He was 33, and the quieter of the 2 brothers, which Patricia had learned long ago, did not mean the kinder. Kevin's silence was not the silence of a man who disagreed. It was the silence of a man who had decided that disagreement cost too much. Amber sat beside him and had learned from Donna that this was a reasonable way to live. Patricia took her seat. She had been taking that seat at this table for 29 years. It was not at the head, and it was not at either of the honored sides. It was the seat nearest the kitchen door, which made it easier for her to get up and refill things. And she understood now, in the way you understand something you have always known, but never said plainly, that this had been intentional from the beginning. Gerald placed both hands flat on the table and cleared his throat. He had found a buyer for Hollow Creek Farm. He said it the way he said most things, not as information being shared, but as a conclusion being delivered. Cash offer, closing before the end of the month. The number he named was not nothing. Divided 4 ways, it was enough to matter, which was the only arithmetic Gerald considered relevant. Patricia looked at the pot roast cooling on its platter and thought about the letter she had received 3 years ago from Walters State Community College. She had never actually received it, of course. She had only learned about its existence 6 weeks ago when Lena Marsh pressed a photocopy into her hand at the farmer's market with the particular gentleness of someone delivering news they wish they did not have to deliver. The letter had been an acceptance into the veterinary technician program. It had been addressed to Patricia Calloway at this house on Maple Street. It had been returned to the college with her father's signature on the refusal line. She had put that piece of paper in the pocket of her jeans and gone back to selling kale. She thought about it now because Gerald was speaking about what was practical and what made sense for the family and what a woman in her position ought to understand about the value of accepting reasonable circumstances. And she recognized the pattern of the argument, the way you recognize a road you have been driven down many times without ever being allowed to drive. "I'm not signing," she said. The words were the same words she had said every other time this conversation had happened, but something in the quality of them was different. She heard it herself. There was no apology underneath them this time. No hedging, no softening for the sake of making the refusal easier to absorb. Gerald's expression did not change immediately. He was a man who had learned that the most effective display of authority was the slow kind, the kind that makes the other person wait. Brett did not wait. He was on his feet before his father had finished his breath. He said she was selfish. He said she was naive. He said a woman her age with no husband and no income and no real skills ought to understand what she was turning down. And he said it with the particular contempt of someone who has rehearsed the cruelty enough times that it comes out smooth. Kevin looked at his plate. Donna let the silence after Brett's speech extend by exactly one beat too long, and then she said in the tone of someone observing rather than participating that she supposed Patricia was holding on to the farm, hoping some man would take it as a down payment on a future with her, since she could not imagine what other reason there might be. Amber laughed the short laugh of someone who has learned that laughing at the right moment costs nothing and earns a kind of safety. Patricia felt the heat rise in her throat. Not tears. She had moved past the place where these people could make her cry, or she thought she had, or she was trying. What rose in her was something older and harder and more useful than grief. It was the particular anger of a woman who has cooked the food and washed the dishes and ironed the shirts and tended the children and been told at the end of it all that she has contributed nothing of value. She looked at each of them. She said the farm was hers, that it had been given to her by her grandmother in a legal document signed by a woman in full possession of her mind, that there was nothing left to discuss. Gerald stood from his chair with the slow deliberateness of a man who wants every movement to say something. He looked at her the way she had seen him look at equipment that had broken down past the point of being worth repairing. He said that if she was not willing to contribute to this family, she was not part of this family. He gave her until the end of the day. He said if she wanted that farm so badly, she could go live on it, and he said it the way people say things they believe will never actually be taken seriously. Patricia waited one more moment. She looked at Kevin, who did not raise his eyes from the tablecloth. She looked at Brett, who reached for the cornbread. She understood then what she had perhaps always known, that no one at this table was going to remember her as a person rather than a problem, that the waiting was over. She stood up, folded her napkin, and walked to her room. The room she had shared over the years with nieces who came to visit on holidays, and cousins who needed somewhere temporary, and the general overflow of a household that had always used her space as though her privacy were a resource belonging to everyone. She opened the bottom drawer of the dresser where she kept the things that were truly hers. The quilt her grandmother Ruth had made for her 15th birthday, blue and cream, the fabric worn soft from years of being the only warm thing in a house that ran cold. The envelope manila and thick with age at the corners containing the deed and the legal documents for Hollow Creek farm papers she had read so many times that she knew the legal language by heart. A photograph of her mother taken before the sickness, standing in front of a mimosa tree, with her arms open and her eyes squinting against the sun. 3 days of clothes, $340 in cash that she had saved in a coffee can behind her winter boots, $5 and $10 at a time, across 3 years of having no income that anyone in this house acknowledged. She packed all of it into the canvas duffel bag that had been her mother's. She put on her grandmother's quilt as a shawl because it was October, and the mountains were already cold at night, and because she wanted to wear something that had been made for her on purpose. She went out the front door. She did not say goodbye because she already knew that no one would say it back. Clover Creek, Tennessee, on a Sunday afternoon in October, has the particular stillness of a small town on a day when most people are inside and the ones who are not have nothing urgent to do. Patricia walked the length of Maple Street with her bag over one shoulder and her head level. She felt the attention of the town on her the way you feel weather changing. Mrs. Henderson looked up from the marigold she was deadheading in her front yard. The two men outside the barber shop stopped their conversation. A truck slowed down more than the speed limit required. She knew how the story would be told by Tuesday. She knew the version that would circulate, the one in which she was difficult and ungrateful and had chosen a pile of weeds in the middle of the mountains over her own family. She had been the subject of other people's versions of her life for long enough that she had developed a specific relationship with the knowledge it hurt less than it used to, but it did not stop hurting entirely. She was passing the front window of Marsh's general store when the door opened. Lena Marsh was 45 years old and had run the store on her own since her husband left for Knoxville with a woman named Carrie 7 years ago, and she had the particular self-possession of a woman who has survived something and come out the other side with very little patience for pretense. She stepped out carrying a paper bag and handed it to Patricia without preamble or explanation. Inside was a half loaf of bread, a box of crackers, a small jar of peanut butter, and 2 apples. Lena did not offer comfort. She did not ask questions. She looked directly at Patricia and nodded once, the nod of one woman to another that means something like, "I see what is happening here and I want you to know that I see it." Patricia held the bag and felt for the first time that day that she was a person and not a problem. She said thank you. Lena went back inside. Patricia kept walking. Her pickup truck was the only thing she owned that Gerald had not found a way to diminish. She had bought it herself 2 years ago for $1,200 from a retired teacher in Harriman, and it ran with the loyalty of something that knows it is appreciated. She drove out of Clover Creek and north into Morgan County as the afternoon light went orange and then pink and then the particular deep blue that comes just before full dark in the mountains. The road to Hollow Creek Farm was not really a road. It was a gravel lane that turned to hard-packed dirt a mile in and followed the contour of a ridge before dropping down into a creek bottom where her grandmother's land began. Patricia had driven it in daylight and knew it was passable. She had not driven it in the approaching dark before. She parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a long moment before getting out. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure built in the 1930s from local stone and timber, and it had the dignity of something that was made to last, even if it had not been maintained. The porch roof sagged at the left corner where a support beam had given way. 2 windows on the upper floor were covered with plywood from some repair that had never been finished. The front door hung slightly off true in its frame. The yard was chest-high in goldenrod, and Queen Anne's lace gone to seed, and the barn beyond the house had lost most of its roof on the east side so that the structure leaned into the remaining half like someone favoring a bad hip. Patricia stood in the dark and took inventory of all of it. She had told herself in the months of refusing to sign the papers that she could do this. She had imagined some version of herself that already knew how to do the things this place would require, or that could learn quickly enough, or that would find the learning easier than the fear. Standing in the October dark with her canvas bag and her grandmother's quilt and $340, the imagined version of herself felt very far away. What she knew how to do was cook, clean, organize, care for children, keep a household running in the invisible way that households require, the way that no one notices until it stops. She had spent 29 years becoming expert in the labor that no one calls labor, and now she was standing in front of 120 acres of Tennessee mountainside and a house that needed everything, and none of what she knew how to do was going to fix the roof or clear the field or get the water running. She went inside anyway. The front room smelled of dust and old wood and the particular absence of people that settles into a space after enough time has passed. The furniture her grandmother had left was still there, covered with drop cloths that had themselves accumulated a layer of grime. A mason jar on the windowsill held the dry stems of something that had once been wildflowers. The kitchen beyond the front room had a cast iron wood stove and a hand pump at the sink and a row of empty shelves where her grandmother had kept her canning. She found the only chair that was not covered, a straight-backed wooden chair near the kitchen table, and she sat down in it, and then she cried. She cried for the meal she had cooked that no one would remember. She cried for her mother, who had died of a sickness that the doctors in Clover Creek had called different things in different years, and that her father had called weakness, and who had been buried without Patricia being allowed to say goodbye because Gerald believed that funerals were not appropriate for children, which was his particular way of believing that grief was not appropriate for anyone. She cried for the version of herself who had waited by the mailbox for letters from community colleges and had never understood why none came. She cried until her throat hurt and her eyes burned and the chair creaked beneath her like it was registering its own complaint. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat in the silence. From somewhere outside, far down toward the creek, a screech owl called once and then went quiet. Patricia got up and looked through the kitchen drawers until she found a box of matches and a stub of candle in a mason jar lid. She lit the candle and carried it with her as she walked through the house, not looking for anything specific, just learning the dimensions of what she was in. In the second kitchen drawer, under a wooden spoon and a rusted can opener, she found a small envelope. It was sealed and addressed in handwriting she recognized immediately, the careful, slightly formal cursive of a woman who had learned to write when penmanship was considered a form of character. It said, Patricia. She sat down on the kitchen floor with the candle between her knees and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small brass key, old and heavy, the kind that belongs to a padlock rather than a door. The paper had one paragraph. Her grandmother had written, "The seeds are in the red barn in the wooden chest behind the south wall. The soil by the creek is good soil. I watched you learn things your whole life without anyone ever giving you credit for the learning. You know more than you think you do. Come spring, the land will show you the rest. I am sorry I could not be there. I love you more than this farm, but I left you the farm because it is the closest thing I know to leaving you myself." Patricia read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt next to the photograph of her mother. She carried the candle to the front room, spread her grandmother's quilt on the floor in front of the cold wood stove, and laid down on it with the canvas bag as a pillow. Through a gap in the boards where the window met its frame, she could see a strip of night sky in the hard, cold light of autumn stars. She thought I may have made the worst decision of my life today. She thought there is no road back. She thought if there is no road back, then the only thing left to do is find the road forward. She slept before she finished the thought. The first week at Hollow Creek Farm was an education in the distance between what a person intends and what a person is actually capable of. The hand pump at the kitchen sink produced water that smelled of iron and old earth, usable for washing, but not for drinking without boiling, which required wood, which required splitting, which required an axe she found in the barn, and muscles that had to be recruited from somewhere she had not known to look for them. Her hands blistered, and then the blisters tore, and then calluses began to form in the places where the blisters had been. And she understood that this was how the body learns, by suffering and then adjusting. Her food ran out on the third day. On the fourth morning, she walked the creek bottom and found what she was looking for, without fully knowing she was looking for it. Wild ramps growing thick in the leaf litter, under the sycamores, and dandelions still holding its rosettes flat against the cold ground, and watercress in the shallow current at the edge of the stream. She knew these plants because her grandmother had taught her their names on summer mornings a long time ago, walking this same ground, and the knowledge had waited in her the way knowledge waits when no one has needed it yet. She cooked the ramps and dandelion greens in a cast-iron skillet with salt from a tin she found in the pantry. She ate standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard, calculating. On the fifth day, two men in a white pickup truck came up the lane and introduced themselves as representatives of Roger Whitfield Realty out of Wartburg. They said a client had expressed interest in the property and asked if she would be open to a conversation about an offer. She asked who the client was. They did not answer directly, but one of them mentioned Brett Calloway, in the process of explaining that they were only acting as intermediaries, and the mention was enough. Patricia opened the gate and pointed down the lane. They smiled the smiles of men who are confident that the person refusing them will change their mind in a few weeks when circumstances have had time to adjust attitudes. She watched the truck turn around and disappear down the hill. Then she turned back to the yard and looked at what needed to be done next and went back to doing it. On the seventh day, she was sitting on the bank of Hollow Creek, with her feet in the water and her back against the trunk of the great white oak that had been there since before her grandmother bought the land, the tree that her grandmother had called the listening tree because she said it had heard more of this family's business than any living person. Patricia was not sitting there because she was resting. She was sitting there because she was seriously considering the logistics of defeat, calculating the minimum amount of apology she would need to offer Gerald in order to secure a roof over her head before winter, when she heard a voice from the other side of the creek. "You Ruth Calloway's granddaughter." The woman who emerged from the rhododendron on the far bank was not a woman you could estimate easily. She might have been 70, or might have been older, with the kind of face that stops aging at a certain point because it has finished becoming what it is. Her skin was dark and deeply lined. Her hair was white and gathered at the back of her neck with a strip of cloth. She wore a house dress with a repeating pattern of small blue flowers mended visibly in 3 places, and rubber-soled shoes that had seen considerable use. She was carrying an enameled pot with a dish towel tied over the top, and she crossed the creek on the stepping stones with the ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times, her feet finding the right rocks without her eyes needing to look down. She set the pot on the bank, untied the dish towel, and revealed venison stew, a wedge of cornbread wrapped in foil, and a jar of sourwood honey. Her name was Mae Harper. She had been living on the adjoining property for 46 years in a cabin she had built on a piece of land Ruth Calloway had given her the right to use back in 1978, when Mae had come to Morgan County from Harlan County, Kentucky, with nothing to her name after her husband was killed in a roof collapse at the number 11 mine. Ruth had found her sitting on a bench outside the Morgan County courthouse, and instead of giving her money which runs out, she had given her ground which lasts. Mae said this without sentiment. She said it the way people state facts about weather or geography, things that are simply the case. Patricia ate the stew and listened, and told Mae in broad outline what had happened. Mae listened without interrupting, which Patricia recognized as a form of respect she had not often been paid. When Patricia finished, Mae was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come by tomorrow morning. We'll start with the pump." She retied the dish towel over the empty pot, crossed the creek on the same stones, and disappeared back into the rhododendron. Patricia sat with the sourwood honey in her lap and felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the first evidence that hope might be available if she kept moving in the direction she had started. Mae Harper arrived the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, carrying a canvas bag of tools in a manner that suggested she had no patience for preliminaries. She showed Patricia how the hand pump worked a specific worn spot on the leather gasket that was allowing air to bleed into the suction, and replaced it with a section of rubber from an old inner tube she had brought in her bag. The pump began to draw clean water within the hour. Mae explained once clearly what had been wrong and how she had fixed it. She did not repeat herself. That was the first thing Patricia learned about Mae Harper. She said things once completely, and then she expected you to have learned them. Over the days that followed, Mae arrived each morning with whatever tools and materials the day's work required. She showed Patricia how the soil in the creek bottom was different from the soil on the hillside, high in clay and acid from decades of leaf fall, and how to read the color and texture of it to know what it needed before anything would grow. She walked Patricia through the barn and identified what was salvageable from what was not. She showed her where the deer trails crossed the property and where the spring seep ran underground before surfacing at the lower corner of the old garden plot, and she showed her how to trace it. Patricia wrote nothing down. She did not need to. The information was landing in the part of her that had always learned this way by doing and watching, and doing again the same part of her that had learned to make biscuits without a recipe and to read a child's temperature by touch, and to know when a silence in a room meant something different from what the people in it were saying. Mae watched her work and said at the end of the second week without inflection, "You've got good hands." It was the most complete compliment Patricia had ever received. She was mending the fence line along the south pasture on the afternoon of the last day of October when she heard the sound. It came from the direction of the creek, long and wavering, and unmistakably distressed, the sound of an animal in need. She followed it. At the bend in the creek where the water slowed and widened, standing in the shallows and drinking with the urgency of something that had been without water for days, was a horse. Black from nose to tail, the color of cast iron, with a neck arched and muscles that even under the dirt and the dried blood on his shoulders spoke of breeding and expense. He had cuts on both front legs, not fresh, healing badly. He lifted his head when he heard her, and the look he gave her was the kind that keeps its distance already calculated and its escape route already chosen. Patricia stood still. She did not approach. She went back to the house and found the only thing she had that was sweet, a handful of dried apple rings from a bag Mae had brought, and she came back to the creek and held them out at arm's length from a distance that did not crowd him. The horse did not come to her hand, but he did not leave. She sat down on the creek bank close enough that he could see her clearly, far enough that he did not need to decide anything. And she began to talk. She told him about the pot roast and the cornbread and the sound Brett's chair had made when he pushed it back. She told him about the quilt and the key and the letter in her grandmother's handwriting. She told him she did not know yet what she was doing here, or whether she was capable of doing it, but that she intended to find out, and that whatever this place became, no one on it was going to be treated like something that had outlived its usefulness. The horse stood in the creek and listened with his ears forward. That was the beginning of midnight. It was also the beginning of something else, though. Patricia would not understand that until the following Friday, when the sound of a truck engine came up the lane, and a man she had never seen climbed out and stopped at the edge of her yard, hat in hand, and asked if she was the owner of Hollow Creek Farm. His name was Daniel Crawford, and he had the look of a man who had learned early that the world does not reward the ones who wait to be invited. He was 32, lean in the way that comes from work rather than intention, with dark hair pushed back under a wide-brimmed canvas hat and 3 days of beard that suggested not carelessness, but a schedule that did not leave room for it. His truck was a 2009 Ford with a contractor's rack welded to the bed and 200,000 miles on the odometer, and it sat at the edge of Patricia's yard with the engine ticking as it cooled. He had stopped at the property line without being told to. That was the first thing she noticed about him. She said yes, she was the owner. He introduced himself and explained his route: Knoxville to Wartburg to Clover Creek, and then up through the hill communities of Morgan County, delivering hardware and dry goods to households and small operations that were too far from anything to make the drive worthwhile every week. He had heard at the Clover Creek feed store that someone had moved back into Hollow Creek Farm after years of it sitting empty. He passed the lane every week. If she needed supplies brought in, he could do it. No delivery charge, just the cost of the goods. Patricia looked at him the way she had learned to look at offers that arrived without obvious strings attached, which was carefully and without immediate response. Then Daniel Crawford saw the horse. His eyes went to Midnight standing at the edge of the pasture, and something in his face shifted in a way he did not try to conceal. He knew that horse. He said so directly without the buildup of a man preparing you for bad news. That was Colonel Thomas Whitfield's Cemental. His name was Midnight. He had been missing from Whitfield Ranch for going on 5 weeks, and Thomas Whitfield had a standing reward for anyone who brought information about him. Patricia felt the ground change under the conversation. Daniel was not finished. He looked at the horse for a long moment, and then he said that Thomas Whitfield was known in Morgan County for one thing above all others, and it was not a thing that anyone said with admiration. He treated his animals the way he treated the men who worked for him, which was as instruments rather than as living creatures, and he treated his instruments poorly. That horse, he said, had not ended up on her property by accident. Animals with working instincts know where it is safe to stop. Patricia asked him plainly what he was saying. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided to commit to a position. He said he had not seen any horse. Then he told her he would be back the following Friday and that if she needed anything brought up from town, she should leave word with Mae Harper because the people on these routes knew each other's business and word traveled faster than a truck. He put his hat back on, got in the Ford, and drove back down the lane without looking in the rearview mirror. Patricia stood in the November cold and watched the dust settle. Then she walked to the pasture fence and stood near Midnight, not touching, just present, and felt for the first time since leaving Clover Creek that the ledger of the world might not be permanently arranged against her. November came down hard on the mountains. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single week, and the leaves that had still been holding on the ridgeline came down in one long, sustained release, covering the creek bottom in a wet orange mat that smelled of tannin and cold. Patricia worked in it daily. May arrived each morning with whatever the day required, and the farm began slowly and with considerable complaint from its infrastructure to function. The chicken coop went up first, built from the lumber of a collapsed lean-to behind the barn that May had identified as salvageable on her second visit. Patricia had never built anything in her life, and the first section of framing she assembled was wrong in 3 places. May pointed out each error without commentary, and waited while Patricia took it apart and did it again. By the time the structure was complete, Patricia understood framing the way you understand things you have learned through your own mistakes completely and without the need to have it explained again. Two hens came from the Walker farm at the end of the hollow, traded for 2 days of Patricia's labor, helping to clear a fence line. A rooster appeared on his own one morning, standing in the yard as though he had always been there and was merely returning from a brief errand. Mae said some animals make their own decisions about where they belong and left it at that. Daniel Crawford came back on Friday as he had said he would. He brought a 50-pound bag of laying crumble for the chickens, a box of roofing nails, a gallon of roofing tar, and a paper bag from the Clover Creek Bakery that held a loaf of sandwich bread and a small container of honey. He said everything on the porch and did not make a ceremony of it. Patricia tried to pay him for the bread and honey, and he told her to put it toward next week's order. He stayed for an hour, helping her carry the roofing supplies up the ladder to the section of the barn roof that was most urgently failing. He worked without asking for direction and without offering opinions she had not requested. When he left, he said he would be back the following Friday, and that if the situation with the roofing tar gave her trouble, she should try heating it in the direct sun before application because the cold made it stiffen. Patricia watched him drive out and thought that she had met very few people in her life who offered help that was simply help without the architecture of obligation underneath it. She thought about this carefully because she had also learned to be careful about things that appeared to have no architecture of obligation underneath them. Midnight allowed her to touch his neck for the first time in the second week of November. She had been approaching him the same way every day, coming to the pasture fence at the same hour, offering the same open hand, speaking in the same measured voice and waiting. The consistency was the point. She was not trying to impress him. She was trying to be predictable, which is a different thing and a more useful one when the creature you are dealing with has learned that unpredictability means danger. When he finally dropped his head and allowed her palm to rest against his jaw, she did not move for a long time. She stood in the cold with her hand on his face and felt the warmth of him, and understood something she had not had the words for before: that trust is not given. It is accumulated one unremarkable moment at a time until there is enough of it to hold weight. Mae, watching from the barn door, said nothing. Her silence was the only review Patricia needed. December brought snow to the upper elevations and cold rain to the creek bottom, and Daniel Crawford kept coming every Friday. He brought what was on the list and occasionally things that were not on the list: a used copy of a book about pasture management for small farms, a box of water bath canning supplies, a good knife in a leather sheath. He did not explain these additions. Patricia did not ask him to. He began to stay longer. An hour became two, and two became the better part of an afternoon, and the conversations that had begun as the practical exchange of information about supply needs became something that moved in different directions. He asked about the farm, about Ruth, about what she was planning for the spring. She answered him honestly and found in the answering that she was also asking questions she had not known she had. On a Friday in late December, sitting on the porch steps with coffee going cold in their cups, and the ridge above them holding the last pink light of a short day, he told her that people in Clover Creek were saying she had lost her mind, that she was living like an animal up in the hills, that it was an embarrassment to the Calloway name. He said it once flatly and then watched her face. She said she had heard worse from people with better information. He did not bring it up again. What he did bring up 2 weeks later was Thomas Whitfield. Whitfield had not forgotten his horse. He had sent men to check properties throughout the county, working a widening circle from the ranch. It was only a matter of time, Daniel said, before someone came to Hollow Creek Farm with specific questions rather than general ones. Patricia looked at midnight, standing in the pasture in the thin January light, his breath making small clouds in the cold, and she made the same calculation she had been making since the day he arrived. If they came, they came. She was not going to be the one who called. The storm arrived in the second week of January without the kind of warning that would have made it possible to prepare. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between noon and dark, and by midnight it was snowing sideways with a wind that came off the ridge and hit the farmhouse like something with intent. Patricia was awake when she heard it, not the wind, but the sound of the porch roof giving way. The section over the kitchen end of the porch failed at 2 in the morning with a crack that shook the windows. Snow poured through the wep and onto the kitchen floor, and the temperature inside the house, which had been manageable, dropped sharply. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call at 2 in the morning who could do anything useful, and calling felt like a concession she was not willing to make. She put on every layer she owned, retrieved the tarp from the truck bed, and climbed onto what remained of the porch roof with a hammer and a box of the roofing nails Daniel had brought in November. The wind made it difficult to stand. The snow made the surface uncertain. She worked by flashlight, getting the tarp positioned and nailed at the corners, and then waited at the edge with boards she pried from the damaged section. Her hands went from cold to numb, and from numb to something past numb that was not quite pain and not quite the absence of pain. She worked until the tarp was secured and the snow was no longer coming through. Then she climbed down and went inside and built up the wood stove and sat in front of it with her hands wrapped around a cup of hot water because she had not yet made coffee and her hands needed something warm to hold. Mae arrived at first light. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the blue tarp visible through the window, at the snow tracked in from Patricia's boots, at Patricia sitting at the table with her hands around a cup and her hair still wet from the night's work. Mae did not say anything about what she saw. She sat down, added wood to the stove, put the coffee on, and poured 2 cups when it was ready. Before she left that afternoon, she stopped at the door and said without turning around, "Ruth told me once that this farm would know its owner when they came." She paused. "I think it knows now." Patricia sat with that sentence after Mae was gone. She looked out the kitchen window at the yard under snow. The bare arms of the old oaks along the creek, the lean of the red barn against the hill. She had stopped somewhere in the weeks since October, thinking of this place as the thing she had refused to sell. At some point it had become something else. She said the word quietly to the empty kitchen. Home. It was February when she told Daniel the full story. They were on the porch steps again, the evening going dark fast the way February evenings do in the mountains, the temperature falling with the light. She'd been thinking about her mother all day without being able to say why, and when Daniel asked how she had ended up here, she answered him with the whole of it instead of the shortened version she usually offered. She told him about her mother's illness, the years of it, the way it had moved slowly through her body, while the doctors in Clover Creek named it different things, and Drell called it by the one word he always used for things he could not control in women. She told him about being 6 years old and sitting in the corner of her mother's room and understanding without anyone telling her that the person in that bed was disappearing. She told him about Ruth arriving without announcement and taking her by the hand, driving her up into these mountains, setting her down on the bank of this creek under those trees in this exact place and teaching her the names of things. About how that had been the only education she had received that felt like it was given freely without a price attached. She told him about being 9 years old and not being allowed to attend her mother's funeral. About sitting in the bedroom window and hearing the sound of the procession going past on the road below. About Ruth coming to the house afterward when Gerald was at the bar accepting condolences, and taking Patricia to the cemetery and sitting beside her on the cold ground and letting her say whatever she needed to say and cry for as long as she needed to cry. And about what Ruth had said before they left, that Patricia's mother had asked her at the end to watch over her daughter, that the best way Ruth knew how to do that was to make sure Patricia had somewhere in the world that was entirely hers. Daniel listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark pasture where midnight was invisible against the night sky. Then he told her his own version of the same story briefly and without self-pity. No mother, a father who had chosen bourbon over everything else available to him and who had died owing more than he owned. Two older brothers who had settled the estate before Daniel understood there was an estate to settle. He had started driving delivery routes because it was work that asked only for reliability and did not require a reference or a family name, or a reason why you did not have more to show for your years than you did. He said it the way people describe terrain they have crossed and put behind them, not without acknowledgement, but without the weight of someone still standing in it. They sat in the silence that followed, and Patricia understood that what she felt in that silence was recognition. The specific recognition that passes between people who have survived similar weathers, who carry the same kind of scar tissue in the same kind of place, and who rarely find anyone else who knows where to look for it. She did not say any of this out loud. She did not need to. Then March came, and the world that had been building quietly under the snow came up all at once. The creek bottom flooded briefly and then drained and left behind the dark, rich smell of turned earth. The redbuds came out on the south-facing slopes before anything else, and then the serviceberry, and then the whole hillside began the slow, complicated business of returning to green. Patricia had the garden turned and planted by the first week of the month. Kale and turnips and winter squash, still in garlic, pushing up in the row she had put in during October. She had been selling at the Clover Creek Farmers Market every Thursday since February, driving down in the early dark with the truck bed loaded, and the sales had been modest but consistent, and they were hers, earned by her hands from her land. It was at the market in early March that Lena Marsh found her. Lena came to her table between customers, and she was carrying a folded piece of paper with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been deciding whether to deliver it and has finally decided yes. She set it on the table and said only that Patricia should read it when she had a moment, and that she was sorry she had not found it sooner. Patricia read it standing behind her table of kale and garlic scapes. It was a photocopy of an enrollment confirmation from Walters State Community College, Veterinary Technician Program, addressed to Patricia Calloway, dated 3 years ago. At the bottom in the margin, someone at the college had written in pen returned refused by resident, and below that a signature, Gerald Calloway's signature. Patricia had suspected this since the day Lena first mentioned the letter. Suspecting a thing and seeing the proof of it in someone's handwriting are not the same experience. She looked at her father's signature at the bottom of that page and felt the last room she had been keeping unlocked inside herself close and lock, with a sound she could hear clearly even in the noise of the market. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. She sold the rest of her kale. She drove home. She did not cry, and she did not call anyone, and she did not say anything about it to Daniel when he came that Friday. She put the paper with the other important documents in the manila envelope, and she understood that she would need it again, and that when she needed it, she would know what to do with it. What she did not know was that the following week, 2 men in a truck bearing the Whitfield Ranch logo would pull into her lane and ask with great politeness to see the horse. They came on a Wednesday, which was not a day Daniel visited, and Mae had already gone home by the time their truck appeared. They were polite in the way that people are polite when they represent someone who does not need to be impolite because the power is already understood. They said Colonel Whitfield had reliable information that his missing horse was on this property. They said they were just there to verify. They said if she would simply let them see the animal, they could resolve the matter quickly and everyone could go home satisfied. Patricia listened to all of it. Then she told them that any animal present on her property had arrived there of its own accord and was receiving appropriate care. She told them that she was familiar with the relevant sections of Tennessee livestock law regarding abandoned animals found on private land, which was partially true in that she had read those sections 3 nights ago in anticipation of exactly this conversation. She told them that if Colonel Whitfield had a legal claim he wished to pursue, he was welcome to pursue it through the proper channels, and that until such time as she received documentation from a court, she would be managing her own property as she saw fit. They looked at her for a moment. They said they would pass that along. They drove back down the lane and she stood in the yard until the sound of their engine was gone, and then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had decided belatedly that the conversation had been more frightening than she had let herself feel during it. Midnight came to the fence and stood there watching her. She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "Me too." It was Daniel who brought her the information she most needed and least expected. He came the following Friday with his delivery in the particular expression of a man who is carrying news and has been deciding how to deliver it. He told her that in Nashville he had a standing offer. A logistics company looking to expand its regional operation, a contracted route, a salary rather than per delivery, pay a newer truck. He had received the offer in January. He had not accepted it or declined it. The deadline for his decision was 10 days away. Patricia looked at him. She did not ask the obvious question because she understood that he was telling her this not as an announcement but as a disclosure, and that there was a difference. He told her about the offer the same way he had told her about his father, without self-pity, without asking her for anything, just making sure she had the information. And then he picked up the roofing tar and the bag of canning lids she had ordered and carried them to the porch and went back to the truck for the rest. He did not say what he planned to decide. He came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that. Mae told her without being asked that she had heard about the Nashville offer from a woman at the Wartburg grocery whose nephew worked for the logistics company. Mae said this while feeding the chickens, not looking at Patricia in the tone of someone mentioning the weather. She said, "Man's got a good reason to leave, and he's still showing up every Friday." Then she scattered the rest of the feed and went to check on the tomato seedlings she had started in the cold frame along the south wall of the house. Patricia stood in the yard and thought about that for a long time. It was at the end of March on an afternoon when the light had finally decided to stay past 5 o'clock, and the creek was running high and clear from the snowmelt on the upper slopes, that 4 horsemen came down the lane. She heard them before she saw them, hoofbeats on the hardpack, and looked up from the garden bed where she was working to see Brett at the front of the group, riding with the posture of a man performing authority for an audience. Behind him came Kevin, head angled slightly down. Behind Kevin came 2 men in business clothes who were not from Morgan County, who had the look of people accustomed to delivering paperwork as a form of force. Patricia set down her trowel. She wiped her hands on her canvas apron. She walked to the gate and stood there and waited. Brett dismounted without greeting here. He held out a manila envelope with the gesture of someone doing her a favor she had not requested. Inside was a legal notice from the Morgan County Circuit Court. The Calloway family, represented by William Farrow of Farrow and Associates in Knoxville, had filed a petition to invalidate the last will and testament of Ruth Mae Calloway. Grounds diminished mental capacity at the time of signing, Supporting argument, the property had failed to demonstrate productive use in the 2 years following the testator's death, evidencing the named beneficiary's incapacity to manage real property. She had 90 days to demonstrate productive use before a judge. If she failed, the will would be set aside and the property would go to public auction. Proceeds to be distributed equally among the surviving family. She read it once. She read it again. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She looked at Brett. Kevin had not dismounted. He was looking at the garden, at the kale rows and the turnips and the garlic pushing up strong in the early spring light, at the repaired fence line, at the chickens moving through the yard at midnight, standing at the pasture gate with his head up and his attention fixed on the newcomers. Kevin's expression was the one she had not been able to name at the dining room table in October. She could name it now. It was shame. Not enough shame to make him do anything differently, but shame nonetheless. Brett said they had given her fair warning. He said he hoped she understood that this was not personal. She said, "I heard you." He waited for more. There was no more. He remounted and the four of them went back up the lane and the sound of the hoofbeats faded into the afternoon. Mae appeared from the direction of the creek 20 minutes later, as though she had been waiting for the sound of horses to stop before coming up. She read the document with the concentration of someone who reads slowly but understands completely. She said 90 days was not much. She said the Morgan County Court had a habit of looking first at whoever had the better lawyer. Patricia sat on the porch steps with her forearms on her knees and looked at the farm she had spent 5 months bringing back to life, and understood that she could lose all of it. Not because she had failed, not because her grandmother had been unclear in her intentions, but because she had a family that preferred to see this land sold to a stranger than to watch her keep it. She heard a truck. Daniel came up the lane at a pace that told her he had passed the 4 horsemen on his way in and understood that something had changed. He had the delivery in the truck bed, but he left it there. He came to where she was sitting on the steps and she gave him the paper and he read it. He sat down beside her. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he knew a man outside Monterey who was selling feeder calves. Good breeding, the kind that put on weight fast on clean pasture. 8 animals in her lower pasture, documented and tagged, would give any judge in this state clear evidence of active livestock operation. With the garden sales in the restaurant account he knew she had been building in Wartburg, she would have a paper record that no lawyer from Knoxville could dismiss as insufficient. The problem they both knew was money. Patricia said it first. She did not have enough, not for 8 calves, not even close. Daniel looked out at the pasture where Midnight stood watching them with his characteristic stillness. He said he had savings. Years of it accumulated on the road money he had nowhere particular to spend and no particular person to spend it on. He wanted to lend it to her. She could pay it back whenever she was able. Patricia looked at him. She asked him why he would do that, why he would put what he had saved across years of driving those roads into something that belonged to a woman he had known for 5 months. He looked away from her out toward the ridge. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said it in the way that a man says something he has been building toward for a long time without knowing he was building toward it. He had watched her work. He had seen what this place was in October and what it was now. He knew what it cost to build something when every person who should have believed in you had bet against you instead. And he said that he had gotten attached and that he had been trying for a while to figure out if that was something he should say, and he had decided it was. The words landed in her without the alarm she might have expected. She said she would pay him back. He said he knew that. She said she would not fail him. He said, "I know that too." 8 calves arrived the following Tuesday, loud and uncertain, and full of the particular energy of young animals encountering a new place. They filled the lower pasture with noise and motion and the smell of livestock that the farm had not held in years. Patricia and Mae worked through the week reinforcing the fence line, establishing the water system from the creek, building a temporary shelter from lumber she and Daniel had salvaged from the east side of the barn. Daniel stayed through the weekend. He worked without being directed, rising before she did each morning, taking on whatever needed doing with the quiet competence of a man who has spent his life learning to solve problems with available materials. It was on a Saturday afternoon repairing the last section of fence along the creek that he stopped working and looked at her across the fence post he had been setting. He told her he had turned down the Nashville offer. She looked up. He said it the same way he had told her about it, simply without making it larger than it was. He had called them on Wednesday. The salary and the truck in the flat road were what they were, but this was where he was. Patricia held the fencing tool in both hands and looked at him in the low March light. She understood that the man standing on the other side of that fence post had chosen this, not because she had asked him to, not because it was the practical decision, but because something here had taken hold of him in a way he had decided to stop arguing with. She said his name. He looked up. She said, "Stay. Not just for this, for what it's going to be." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once and picked up the fencing pliers and went back to work. What neither of them said, and what Midnight seemed to understand from his position at the pasture gate, watching them with his ears forward and his head level, was that there were 90 days on the clock, and that 60 miles away in Knoxville, a lawyer named William Farrow was building a case, and that somewhere in Morgan County, Thomas Whitfield had not forgotten his horse. The 90 days did not feel like 90 days. They felt like one long, continuous act of will, broken into mornings that began before light and evenings that ended when the body finally refused to continue. The calves settled into the lower pasture within a week of arriving and began doing what well-bred animals do on clean grass they grew. Patricia weighed them every 2 weeks using a livestock tape and recorded the numbers in the notebook alongside the garden receipts and the market tallies and the Wartburg restaurant invoices that now came in monthly. The record was meticulous, not because she had always been meticulous, but because she understood that this particular document was going to have to speak for her in a room where other people would be speaking against her, and she intended it to speak clearly. Mae came every day. She had always come every day, but in those 90 days there was a different quality to her presence, a deliberateness, as though she understood that what was being built in this season was not just a farm, but a case. She showed Patricia how to document the garden yields properly, how to record the weight and condition of the livestock in a format that would read as professional rather than amateur, how to keep the Wartburg invoices in chronological order, with dates and quantities matching the delivery logs. Mae had never had a formal education past the 8th grade. She knew more about the practical administration of a small agricultural operation than anyone Patricia had ever met. Daniel came every Friday and stayed through the weekend. He repaired what broke. He drove Patricia to Wartburg when the restaurant order was too large for her to carry, and helped load the truck at 4 in the morning without being asked. He was building something here alongside her, and the nature of what he was building had shifted past the question of whether it was practical and into the territory of something that does not require justification because it has become simply what is true. The calves gained weight, the garden produced, the hens laid more than she could sell at the market, and she started leaving extra dozens at Marsh's general store on consignment, and Lena Marsh displayed them at the front counter and sold everyone. Clover Creek noticed. Not all of it, and not all of it favorably, but it noticed. The version of Patricia that had been circulating since October, the difficult daughter, the woman who had lost her mind over a piece of mountain land, was beginning to compete with a different version, the woman who had taken a dead farm and made it produce, who drove to market before sunrise and sold out before noon, who rode that black horse through town on Tuesdays like she had been doing it her whole life. Both versions were still in circulation when the date of the hearing arrived. The night before, Patricia sat at the kitchen table and went through the notebook one final time. Everything was there. 8 calves purchase date and price, documented weight gain recorded across 12 weeks. Garden sales totaling more than $3,000 in verified receipts. Restaurant invoices with the Wartburg account contact information clearly listed. A letter from Lena Marsh written on store stationery in Lena's plain and direct handwriting, attesting to the quality and regularity of the eggs and produce she had sold on consignment for the past 4 months. Mae had come that evening and sat across the table while Patricia reviewed the documents, and before she left, she took both of Patricia's hands in hers. Mae's hands were the hands of someone who had worked hard ground for the better part of 7 decades, and the warmth in them was the warmth of something earned rather than given. She said, "The truth spoken with a steady voice always travels further than a well-dressed lie." Then she put on her coat and walked home across the creek in the January dark. Patricia slept 4 hours. She rose before 5 and dressed carefully in the one good dress she owned, a dark blue wool she had bought at a resale shop in Wartburg for $12 the previous fall, and she pinned her hair back and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. Her hands were visible at the ends of her sleeves, calloused at the palm, roughened at the knuckles, the nails cut short and clean. She did not try to hide them. She went out to the barn and saddled midnight in the cold dark. Daniel was waiting in the yard with his truck running. He had offered to drive her, and she had told him she was riding in, and he had accepted this without argument, because he had known her long enough to understand that some decisions she would make for reasons that did not require explaining. He drove alongside her down the lane and then fell back to follow at the horse's pace. And they went into Clover Creek that way, the woman on the black horse and the man in the truck behind her, in the pale January light that sat low over the mountains and made everything look like the beginning of something. People noticed. A man clearing ice from his windshield on Oak Street stopped and watched. 2 women outside the pharmacy turned. An older man sitting on the bench in front of the hardware store stood up without seeming to know he was doing it. Patricia looked straight ahead. The Morgan County Courthouse was a brick building from the 1930s with a flagpole out front and a parking lot that was already half full when she arrived. She tied midnight to the iron ring on the old hitching post at the edge of the courthouse square, the one that had been there since the building was new, and that no one had removed because no one had expected anyone to use it again. She straightened his forelock, put her hand briefly on the side of his neck, and went inside. The courtroom was small and smelled of old wood and radiator heat. The benches on the left side held Brett in a dark suit and Kevin in a tie that looked like it had been chosen under duress. 2 men from Farrow and Associates sat at the plaintiff's table with a briefcase and an air of professional confidence. William Farrow himself, 50 years old, with silver at his temples and the bearing of a man who bills by the hour and does not waste his own time on doubt, arranged his papers without looking up when Patricia entered. Gerald Calloway was not there. The chair where he might have sat was occupied only by its own absence, and that absence said more about Gerald than his presence would have. Judge Harold Pierce entered from the side door and took the bench. He was 65, gray-haired, with a face that had processed enough human difficulty to have stopped reacting visibly to most of it. He looked at the room over the top of his reading glasses and called the session to order. Farrow went first. He was good at what he did. He presented the case the way an experienced attorney presents a case he believes in, which is to say smoothly and without apparent effort, leading the court through the argument as though it were the only reasonable conclusion available. Ruth Calloway, he said, had shown clear signs of cognitive decline in her final years. He cited two documented incidents of disorientation at a local clinic. He noted that the will had been drafted without independent witnesses who could attest to Ruth's state of mind. He argued that the property had stood unproductive for 2 years following Ruth's death, which demonstrated that the named beneficiary lacked the capacity to fulfill the responsibilities of ownership. He concluded that the court should exercise its authority to set aside a will that could not, under honest examination, be considered the product of a sound and competent mind. Brett testified. He said Patricia had always been difficult. He said she had refused to cooperate with reasonable family decisions. He said she had abandoned the household and moved to an isolated property on what he described as an impulse, and that the results spoke for themselves. Kevin stood to testify. He began a sentence. He said, "I just think the land would be better managed if," and then he stopped. Judge Pierce waited. The room waited. Kevin looked at the surface of the table in front of him and did not finish the sentence. He sat down. Farrow's expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness shifted in a way that a careful observer would have recognized as frustration. Patricia was a careful observer. She had been watching Kevin since he walked in, and she watched him now as he sat with whatever he had decided not to say still visible in the set of his shoulders, and she understood something she had not expected to understand in this room. Kevin knew. He had always known. It had simply never been enough to make him do anything differently. And for the first time, she felt something toward her brother that was not anger and was not forgiveness, but was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. Then Judge Pierce looked at Patricia. She stood. She had no attorney. She had the notebook, the letter from Lena Marsh, and the manila envelope of supporting documents. She had her hands, which she placed flat on the table for a moment before she began, as though she were steadying herself against a surface that was firm and real. She started with Ruth, not with the legal argument, not with the production records. She started with a woman who had understood long before anyone else did that the child in her son's house was not being seen, and who had done what she could with what she had. To change that, she talked about the summers at this farm, the names of plants, the reading of weather, the way her grandmother had talked to her, as though what she thought and felt and noticed were information worth having. She talked about being 9 years old and sitting in a window listening to a funeral procession go past on the road below, because her father had decided she did not need to attend her own mother's burial. She reached into the envelope and placed the photocopy of the Walters State Enrollment Confirmation on the table. She slid it toward the judge and said only, "This acceptance letter was sent to my father's house 3 years ago. It was returned to the college with my father's signature refusing delivery. I learned about its existence 2 months ago." She let the document sit there and moved on. She talked about October, the pot roast on the platter, the sound of Brett's chair, the walk down Maple Street with the canvas bag, the farmhouse in the dark. Then she opened the notebook. She walked Judge Pierce through every entry. Purchase date for the calves, 12 weeks of weight records, the arithmetic of gain. Garden yields by week, market receipts by date, restaurant invoices with contact information. She placed Lena's letter on top of the stack and said that Lena Marsh had been selling her eggs and produce on consignment since November and had never had a bad batch and never had an unsatisfied customer. She said, "My grandmother was not confused when she signed that will. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was leaving this property to the person who would love it enough to make it into something, not to the people who would convert it into cash as quickly as possible. She said, "My brothers have not set foot on that land in years. Not one day of work, not $1 of investment. I have done everything that has been done there with help from a neighbor who is 72 years old and a man who drives a delivery route for a living. And I have more to show for 6 months of that than this farm produced in the decade before I arrived." Her voice had started at a controlled pitch and had been rising steadily, not into anger but into something more structural, the particular solidity of a person who has run out of reasons to moderate themselves for the comfort of the people who are trying to take from them. Pharaoh stood to object to the characterization of his client's motivations. The courtroom door opened. 3 men walked in. The one in front was 65 years old and wore a Harris tweed jacket and carried a hat of the same material in his right hand. His bearing was the bearing of someone who has been obeyed long enough that authority has become postural rather than performed. A gold ring on his right hand caught the light from the overhead fixture as he moved. He came to a stop just inside the door and looked at the room with the calm of a man who understands that his arrival changes the temperature of a room and is neither embarrassed nor inflated by this fact. Thomas Whitfield. Patricia felt the cold move through her in a long, slow wave. She had known somewhere in the back of her mind that this was possible. She had not let herself think about it directly, because thinking about it directly would have required deciding in advance what she would do, and she had not wanted to make that decision until she had to. He was here to say she had his horse. He was going to tell a Morgan County judge that she had been harboring stolen livestock. It would not matter what the notebook said or what Lena's letter said. An accusation of that kind in this room on this day would undo everything. Whitfield asked Judge Pierce's permission to address the court. Pierce, who had the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by what walks through his courtroom door, gave it. Whitfield spoke without notes. He said that several months ago he had lost a horse from his ranch property. A registered quarter horse, valuable animal known to him since the horse was 2 years old. He had searched for the animal for weeks. He had received information eventually that the horse was at Hollow Creek Farm in the care of the woman standing at that table. He paused. Patricia did not move. Whitfield said that he had gone to Hollow Creek Farm the previous week, that he had arrived without announcement, parked on the road, and observed the property from a distance for more than an hour before he was seen by anyone. He said the horse was there. He said the horse was the best he had seen that animal look in 4 years. He described what he had watched midnight moving freely across the pasture, not with the tightness of a confined animal, but with the ease of one that has been given adequate space and consistent handling. He described the horse coming to the fence when Patricia crossed the yard unprompted without being called. He said he had been in horses his entire adult life, and that a horse does not do that with a person it does not trust, and that trust of that kind is not manufactured quickly or maintained carelessly. He said he had then driven to Clover Creek and spoken to 3 vendors at the farmers market who knew Patricia's operation. He had spoken to Lena Marsh. He had spoken to the owner of the restaurant in Wartburg. He said the account he received from every person was consistent, a woman who had arrived with nothing and built something real and lasting with her own hands in less than a year. He said, "That is more evidence of managerial capacity than anything in that briefcase." Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He placed it on the judge's bench. He said, "Those are the transfer papers for the horse, full registration and bloodline documentation. The animal belongs to Patricia Calloway as of this morning." He looked at the document on the bench and then at Patricia and then back at the judge. An animal that chooses where it lives has already made its decision about ownership. I'm not going to argue with that. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something irreversible has just happened and everyone present is still processing the shape of it. Brett had gone the color of old brick. Pharaoh placed both hands flat on his table, a gesture that Patricia recognized with a cold clarity as the gesture her father had used when he was about to say something he intended to be final. Pharaoh said the question of the horse was entirely separate from the question of the will's validity, and that the court should disregard this testimony as irrelevant to the legal matter before it. Judge Pierce removed his reading glasses. He looked at Pharaoh. He looked at the transfer document on his bench. He looked at Patricia. He said, "A will cannot be set aside because the other heirs would have made a different decision. Ruth Calloway had the legal right to leave her property to whoever she chose. The evidence presented that she lacked the mental capacity to make that choice is not credible. Two incidents of disorientation in an 81-year-old woman documented at a rural clinic with no psychiatric assessment on record do not constitute evidence of incompetence." He picked up the notebook Patricia had placed on his bench and held it for a moment without opening it. He said, "This woman came to a derelict property in October with a canvas bag and $300 and turned it into an operating farm in 6 months, without legal counsel, without family support, without capital." He set the notebook down. The petition before this court is not motivated by concern for Ruth Calloway's intentions. It is motivated by financial interest in property that was deliberately and legally excluded from the petitioner's inheritance. He looked at Brett and then with a longer pause at Kevin. That is not a basis for action in this court. He picked up the gavel. The will stands. Hollow Creek Farm is the legal property of Patricia Calloway, sole and uncontested. The sound of the gavel in that small room was the sound of something ending that had needed to end for a long time. Brett was on his feet before the echo cleared. He said they would appeal. He said this was not over. He said it was an injustice, and everyone in the room knew it. Judge Pierce said he was welcome to appeal. He said his ruling was grounded in law and in the plain evidence of the record before him, and that he would sustain it. He suggested that if Brett needed further assistance, he could find it at the clerk's office, and then he turned his attention to the next matter in his folder with the finality of a man who has issued his verdict and moved on. Pharaoh gathered his papers. The two associates from his office gathered theirs. They left without looking at Patricia. Brett left without looking at anyone. Kevin stood last. He pushed back from the table and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, and then he looked at Patricia. Not quickly, not with the averted eyes she had been accustomed to from him for 30 years, but directly with the full weight of whatever he was carrying. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She looked back at him and did not look away. And what passed between them was not forgiveness and was not an ending, but was the honest acknowledgement of a damage that would not be undone from a man who had finally allowed himself to see it. Then he walked out. Sheriff Roy Haynes was standing near the back wall in the way that law enforcement stands when they are present in an official capacity without being central to the proceedings. He caught Patricia's eye as she turned, and he gave her a single nod, brief and without ceremony. It was the nod of a man revising a position he had held too long without examination, and Patricia accepted it as such and moved past it. Whitfield approached her with the transfer papers. He said quietly enough that it was just between them, "I've had that horse for 4 years, and he never once came to the fence on his own. You should know that." He pressed the documents into her hand. If you ever want to talk about breeding or find a market for your cattle as they mature, send word through Crawford. He knows how to find me." He put his hat on and walked out without waiting for her response, which was she understood simply how he operated, a man who said what he meant and did not require the ceremony of being thanked for it. Daniel was at her side. He had been there through all of it, on the bench behind her saying nothing, and now he put his hand on her shoulder, and she felt in that touch everything he had not said during the last 3 hours. She turned to him. She said, "I didn't win alone." He said, "No, but you did the part that mattered." Outside the courthouse, the January light had shifted to the particular clarity that comes in the mountains when the temperature is below freezing and the air has no moisture left in it to diffuse anything. Everything was bright and exact. The bare trees along the courthouse square were precise against the sky. The flagpole threw a sharp shadow across the steps. Midnight was at the hitching post where she had left him, and he turned his head toward her when she came through the courthouse doors, the way he always turned toward her now without being called. She went to him and put her face against his neck for a moment and felt his warmth and steadiness and the particular quality of his attention, which had always felt to her less like the attention of an animal and more like the attention of someone who has decided to pay it. Then she stepped back and looked at Daniel. He had been standing behind her, and now he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, or perhaps she had seen it and had not let herself name it until now. He was 32 years old, and he had turned down a salary and a new truck and a flat road, and he was standing in front of the Morgan County Courthouse in January with courthouse dust on his boots, and he was looking at her like a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. He said her name. She waited. He said he wanted to stay. Not in the way he had been staying, Fridays and weekends, a man with a foot on both sides of a line he had been pretending was not there. He said he wanted to stay the way a person stays when they are done pretending that somewhere else is where they belong. He said he understood if she needed time. He said he was not going anywhere regardless of her answer because the farm needed work in the spring, and he had made commitments to the Wartburg account, and there were 8 calves in that pasture that needed consistent management. He said all of this with the very slight smile of a man who is using the practical reasons because the real reason is too large to lead with. Patricia looked at him for a long moment. She thought about October, the canvas bag on the kitchen floor, the candle stub in the mason jar lid, the strip of stars visible through the gap in the window frame. She thought about Mae crossing the creek with a pot of venison stew, about the roofing nails in the storm, about a horse that had walked out of the dark and found her. She thought about her mother, who had asked Ruth to make sure Patricia had somewhere in the world that was entirely hers, and about Ruth, who had done exactly that in the only way available to her. She said yes. They were married in April in the small church on Milligan Street in Clover Creek, in a ceremony that lasted 35 minutes and was attended by Mae Harper, Lena Marsh, and 3 of her regular customers, the Walker family from the end of the hollow, and a handful of people from the Morgan County farming community who had come to know Patricia at the Thursday market. The pews on the family side were empty of Callaways, and the minister did not remark on this, and neither did anyone else. When they came out of the church, Midnight was tied to the old oak at the corner of the square. His mane had been braided with white ribbons that Mae had woven in before dawn, working in the dark by feel, which was something Mae was fully capable of and did not consider extraordinary. Patricia stood on the church steps and looked at that horse with his braided mane in the April light and felt something so complete that it had no room in it for anything that was not itself. The years that followed were not uncomplicated. No years on a working farm are uncomplicated. There were seasons when the market was slow and seasons when it was not fence lines that needed continual attention, equipment that broke at the worst possible moments, the particular negotiations required by animals in weather, and the hard arithmetic of small agricultural operations. Patricia learned all of it. She had always learned things quickly and completely, and here she had both the necessity and the space to learn without anyone diminishing what she was becoming. She discovered that she had an ability with horses that went beyond what May had first observed. Midnight had been the beginning of it, but it extended outward into every horse she encountered. She began buying young horses from the sales at Cookville and Crossville horses that had been handled roughly or not handled enough, and she worked with them in the lower pasture with the same patience she had used with Midnight, the same consistency, the same refusal to demand more than the animal was ready to offer. Within 2 years, she was selling trained horses to ranchers and riding programs throughout East Tennessee, and Thomas Whitfield sent her 2 buyers in the first year alone. She paid Daniel back in full by the end of the second year. He objected mildly, and she told him it was not open for discussion, and he recognized the tone and accepted the check. Daniel kept his delivery route through the third year and then let it go when the farm had enough work that his presence on it was more valuable than his income off it. He drove to Wartburg and Cookville for supplies and took the horses to the sales and handled the fence line in ways that would have taken Patricia twice as long to do alone. He was not a farmer by training, but he was one by disposition, which is the more reliable of the two. Mae Harper turned 75 in the summer of the second year and showed no signs of slowing. She came to the farm every day as she always had, and her contributions shifted gradually from instruction to something else, something that did not have a clean name. She was the continuity of the place, the living connection to what it had been and what it had been built to become. She told stories. She fed the chickens. She sat with Patricia's daughter in her lap and taught her the names of birds by their calls the way Ruth had once taught Patricia the names of plants by their smell. The daughter was 2 years old the summer that Patricia sat on the porch in the late afternoon and watched everything she had built move in its familiar rhythms before her. The calves from the first year were long gone, replaced by a different and larger operation. The garden had expanded. The chicken flock had stabilized at a number that made economic sense. 12 horses moved in the lower pasture, and their movement had the particular quality of animals that have not been asked to be afraid. Midnight was at the creek bank. He was older now, 8 years old, and there was gray beginning at his temples, the way gray comes to horses who have been well used and well kept. He stood in the late light with the water moving past his feet, and Patricia watched him from the porch and remembered the night he had appeared in the dark wounded and furious and frightened, and she thought about what it had taken to be present with that level of damage without flinching and without forcing and without giving up. She thought it was probably the same thing it took to do most things that were worth doing. Daniel came up the lane at the end of the afternoon with the truck dusty from the Crossville road and his face carrying the particular tiredness of a good day's work finished. He came through the gate and saw their daughter on the porch and picked her up, and the child laughed the way small children laugh when they are completely safe, without reservation, with the full confidence of someone who has never had reason to hold anything back. He kissed Patricia and sat down beside her and looked out at the pasture. May came across the creek on her stepping stones with cornbread and a cloth and a pot of beans that had been on since morning, and she settled into the chair on the far end of the porch that had become her chair over years of this same arrangement, and she told a story to the child that made the child's eyes go wide. Patricia looked at all of it. She looked at it for a long time in the way that you look at something you understand. You are lucky to be seeing, not because luck is all it took, but because you know clearly and without confusion what it cost and what it required and what it would have been possible to lose. And the knowing makes the scene different than it would otherwise be. She had lost the family she was born into. She had found the family he was made for. She had lost a house that was never hers. She had a farm that was hers in every sense that the word can carry, by legal document, by the work of her hands, by the love she had put into every acre of it, and by the decision of a woman who had loved her well enough to give her the one thing she could not give her in person. Hollow Creek Farm had been called by that name for 100 years. The hollow was still there, and the creek still ran through it, and the white oak that Ruth had called the listening tree still stood on the bank. But the forgetting was gone. This place was remembered now every day by the people who lived in it, which is the only way a place is ever truly kept. Patricia leaned back in her chair and listened to the water and the child's laughter and Mae's voice in the evening air, and felt without qualification, without the shadow of what she had left behind, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not arrived here by accident. She had arrived here by the accumulation of every refusal. Every morning she had gotten up when staying down would have been easier. Every decision to stay when leaving would have cost less. The road she had walked out of Clover Creek in October had not led away from anything. It had led here, and here, as it turned out, was where she had always been going.